Change is never easy, and when it comes to large organizations, it can be quite daunting. Change isn't just about implementing new processes, it's really about shifting mindsets, behaviors, and culture. To discuss the intricacies of change management, I'm excited to welcome back SVPG partner Lea Hickman to talk about all of the challenges the best companies in the world face when they go through change, how they mitigate risk, how they accelerate learning, and how they drive impressive results. Lea, it is good to see you. Welcome back to Product Therapy.
It's great to see you, as always, Christian.
Lovely. Well, I think dealing with change is a fitting topic for any type of therapy. Perhaps in the work of the corporate environment, maybe start by saying, why should we care about change? And are there examples of changes in our work that really need to be managed?
Oh, there's nothing but change in the work that we do, especially when we're transforming to the product model and ensuring that the organization is going to be successful in that transformation. Change is a prerequisite for all of the work that we do and absolutely required. However, unfortunately, most organizations don't get it right. And so there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that they take the right approach. I love that you called out mindset, because that's half the battle. Between mindset and culture, that's where the heavy lifting takes place.
You're calling out change is inevitable in any environment, and we kind of know and expect change will happen. Why does it scare us then? It is like, I am telling you, Lea, something is going to change. The one thing you can be sure of is that things will change, but yet we are terrified about it.
Yeah, well, I think because it requires the unknown. We're not going to be able to predict all of the activities. We're not going to be able to predict all of the outcomes 100%. And so with that unknown, people get very, very nervous because not all change is predictable.
When I think about change, I always say people tune in to their own personal radio channels, like what's going to happen to me or what's in it for me. And I think even when we know change is coming, those things just are radar for those questions kind of lights up. Like, how does it affect me? And one of the things I think I see in many environments is they kind of describe change as something that is happening to the company and ignore the fact that it's still happening to an individual. Like, the company is being acquired. We are changing the org structure. We are launching a new product. And I always have to say, even when you build a product, you make a change in the world. When you change an org structure, when you buy a company, when you change your strategy or a vision, when we build a product, we always say the change affects the customer, affects the brand, your reputation, affects your employees. I think one of those elements you're calling out is that uncertainty. I want to kind of go deep on how we make it easier for people to accept change. We've kind of said it's coming. Is there some mental playbook for you when you're trying to make a big change at an organization? Maybe get me through your thinking. Where do you start? What groundwork do you lay in order to start this effort?
The anti-pattern that I try to avoid, and I'll get to answering your question, when leadership tries to delegate the change management or the change in the organization. And this especially takes place with large-scale organizations. In some cases, they even have groups or a portion of the organization that's focused on change management. And when leadership brings in the change management team and delegates the work around change management to that team, that's the first anti-pattern that is worth calling out. And the reason why it's an anti-pattern is because most leaders underestimate the personal commitment and time required to manage through that change. It's always underestimated because we tend to think about things as processes or steps to take, but we don't account for all of the variables that always come into place. And the biggest variable that I see is the human side of it. And you speak about this all the time, right? Every problem's a people problem. Same holds true with change management. And people tend to be the biggest variables in all of this.
I'm really trying to think about how we ignore the reality about the change happening to people, why it's very tempting for leaders to delegate change. They make a decision and the implementation of that decision is delegated. We are going to now do this. We are moving to this. And you tell somebody else to control or drive the narrative or get everybody on the bus.
Yeah.
What creates that temptation to delegate it or run away from the actual execution of that change?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest myth is that all of the work is done once the decision has been made. That's a myth because all of the work actually takes place after the decision has made. The implementation is going to be the success or failure of any kind of change in an organization. And unfortunately, we don't look at it that way. A lot of times with leaders, we look at, okay, I did all of this analysis, all of this work. I got together with all of these key stakeholders. We made the decision. However, the success or the failure is going to be based on what we do after that decision is made.
Oh, that is so key. Lea, one of the things I see many people do with change is there are situations in which they do big bang changes, and then there are situations in which they do these small incremental changes. And I don't know if there's necessarily a right or wrong. I mean, we advocate for a certain pattern in transformation for how you go about changing. Are there situations where you should do a big bang change, almost like a mandate change? And are there situations where you should go incremental? And maybe if you can think of some examples of when you might use one or the other, that would be helpful.
I mean, I think in general, incremental change in some organizations is going to be more successful, especially if we believe that the culture requires proven success to continue on that path of transformation. And a lot of this is dependent on the culture. In some cases, if we need to prove success, which I'm a big fan of, incremental change, it doesn't have to happen slowly, but it doesn't also have to happen all at once. Incremental change, once we prove it out, can have a significant impact in the organization. However, there are times where that big bang is required, right? Your earlier example of an acquisition is a perfect example. We're either acquiring a new company or the company is being acquired by someone else. There is a specific point in time where that change has to take place. And doing that quickly and succinctly is very, very effective because I've seen a lot of situations where when we've acquired an organization, we wait or we defer the change or the integration of that organization, and then the host organization basically rejects it. We talk about antibodies rejecting the new organ, so to speak. So in those cases, I think that big bang change is really effective. Having said that, let me make a personal example. At the beginning of the year, when it's January 1st, everyone usually makes a New Year's resolution. Did you make a New Year's resolution this year?
Of course.
Of course you did. And so your New Year's resolution, not to project this on you, was probably want to drop a couple pounds. I want to get in better shape. I want to pick up a
Yeah.
new exercise routine. And this is a case for incremental change. Whenever we decide to do that, you're not going to be able to be successful if all of a sudden you're going to cut out all red meat in your diet and cut out all, soda pop or whatever it is. Usually what you do is you do incremental changes. Like I will only have red meat once a week, or, I will start running twice a week. Those incremental changes are going to be even difficult for you at the beginning, but over time it becomes easier and easier to adapt that. And at the end of that change, you never even realize that you changed to begin with because it's so second nature. I think organizations are very, very similar, where any kind of change is difficult to begin with, but if you stick with it and you have that repetition and it becomes ingrained in the culture, it just becomes second nature to the organization. I
Oh,
know it's a silly metaphor to use.
no, it's a great
But
one.
it's something that everyone can relate to.
Yes.
In the organization, I think usually incremental, while it might take a little longer, I think it also lasts longer and becomes ingrained in the culture.
You're calling out something that I want to emphasize with change, because I think many people look at the technical or the tactical aspects of change with the process, the procedures, and you're calling out the aspects of, we talk about mindset, we talk about behaviors, we talk about culture, language, and they ignore that in the change process. And I think some of this may be related to the mindset of how companies work or how they solve problems, particularly going back to the project mindset or the project model versus the product model. You're saying, we want to change something. And so you kind of say, let's have a project to change it. It's big bang, it's end game. It's kind of like we're moving the lever from left to right. In the product model, we recognize we don't know. We know the outcome we want. We iterate on it. We have this kind of discovery mindset. And I think there's some of this acknowledgement that any form of change may be replacing one behavior from another, replacing one mindset with another, making some integrate changes in the culture to reinforce that. One of the first levers when I think about change is the motivation. Even in transformations, I often joke with companies. I'm like, why are you serious about doing this? Why? And it's kind of like the case. What is the case for change? Because if people resist change, if they don't understand its necessity, what are some ways you make it visible? Like, how do you make people understand why are we changing? What are things you do?
I'm a huge fan of being declarative on the why. All of us have read the book Start With Why by Simon Sinek, this notion of everyone wants to understand the reasoning and the rationale behind everything that we do. Same is true when we build products, understanding what problem to solve, why that's a problem worthy of solving, who are we solving that problem for. The same holds true with change. Leaders need to be declarative about why we need to change to a different operating model or a different approach or a different mindset, and be as declarative and explicit about that rationale and the reasoning. And part of the reason why, especially in large-scale organizations, usually at the senior levels of the organizations, the executives understand why, right? It might be a competitive threat. It might be tired of, returns on our technology investments. It might be the valuations that the competitors are getting because of their different business model or the approach to innovation. Whatever that rationale is, the senior executives typically get it. The teams typically get it too, right? They understand why they want to be empowered, why they want to operate a certain way. But it's the management in the middle who have built their career operating in a certain way. So if I have tenure in an organization, and I've worked with lots of organizations where this has been the case, middle management has been in the organization for 10 plus years. What has got them successful in that organization has been acting a certain way, playing by a certain rule book, building relationships with different folks in the organization. Any kind of introduction to change threatens that, right? And that's a really scary place to be. And unfortunately, that's where most of the work gets done in the organization. And so you have to explain to folks why they should be incented to change or take a different approach. Why should they be empowered to learn a different operating model? And so that's where I think a lot of the heavy lifting takes place. And if senior leaders don't explain why they should care about it and why it's going to be good, not only for the organization, but good for them, it's going to be very difficult for them to change.
Oh, I love that. You're calling out this middle layer, and we need to come back to this. But, I was just doing a coaching session with a leader, and he kept emphasizing to people, we are moving to the product model, or we need to move to the product-led company and organization. And I was saying, well, you're starting a change. And many people have an interpretation of what does that mean? What will happen to me? Who is getting power? Who is losing power? We are moving from what to what? What's wrong with what we have today? And he says, so Christian, what do I say? I say, well, make it personal. Use data. Tell a story. And I said, let me give you a good story. Your competitor is building and shipping 3 times faster than you are because they empower their teams to make a better decision. If you don't shift, you risk losing your market position. All of a sudden, everybody sees the threat. They have some real data. They have some sense of a story or a narrative that they reinforce to themselves. Why are we changing? It's like we're changing to compete. We're changing to win. We're changing because of a threat. We're changing because we can accomplish more. And I think, you're highlighting there's a comfort layer between the people with the strategic direction and the people that execute against it. And we call that our middle management that reinforces it, that is most resistant to change. Because, they are the ones that have to actually do the work of managing the change, reinforcing and incentivizing the change. So, probably a very big piece, when we say if number one, we're understanding the why or establishing the why or creating an urgency for change. I think number 2 for me is kind of that alignment, because if you're getting buy-in for the top, you need champions for your change. I've seen many companies where I speak to the CEO and the CEO is like, we are so excited about this change. And then you speak to the team, like you say, and they're like, yeah, we want to walk this way. Empower us. We will make great things. And then the next month, you're like, yeah, nothing really happened. And the CEO will often ask me, like, why? I am the CEO. I said I want this. And everybody said, yeah. So let's go a little deeper on this resistance to change and this middle management. How do you create key influencers? Let's call them change champions of these people to reinforce the changes you want in your culture.
Well, I do think it's not just getting them on board, but it's also educating them on what the change looks like and how to implement the change. And I think that it is a big ask to ask someone who's, been in the organization a while, probably grew up in the organization, learned all of their skills within the organization to act in a way that's never been taught or supported in that organization. That's a big ask. And we see this all the time. Some of the symptoms that we see are an organization gets excited about the product operating model. They believe that an empowered product team needs to have product managers on it. So they go and they take all their product owners or business analysts and they retitle them to product management. And they say, we now have empowered product teams because we have product managers. We see this pattern all the time, Christian, right? And part of the reason, I think that's a symptom of not fully embracing what a product manager is and training these folks on what great looks like from a product management perspective. So I think there's a level of learning, education, and depth in that learning and education and coaching, quite frankly, to make sure that those middle managers, the ones who are getting all the work done and structuring and supporting and managing the organization, they really know what great looks like. That's one of the biggest challenges I see. And so this is where, quite frankly, coaching those folks to understand what great looks like is really, really important. And I think it helps get a higher likelihood of success in the
Oh, I
organization.
love that point. I always try to tell organizations you have to make the shift from training to coaching.
Yeah. Yep.
Training is kind of that one-time event. Coaching ensures you get ongoing support. And many managers are probably pushing back, not because they don't believe in the change, but they don't even know what good looks like to reinforce the change.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's no fault of themselves, right?
Yes.
Like it's not their fault that they've contextually have never been in that situation. And again, it goes hand in hand with making sure you don't delegate it. So like if you really want to drive the change in the organization, you need to support those managers in the organization to really understand what great looks like. The only way you can do that is to coach them.
So, a pointed question, if you were a leader, if I were asking you, Leah, do we make this change if we do not know how to change? It's kind of like do we make this change if we don't know how to reinforce and equip people and sustain this change? Is it worth doing? This timing is the right thing to do, but we don't have an environment to reinforce it. What do you do?
Christian, that's part of the reason why I love the idea of pilot teams. Let's make the change in a pocket. Let's prove success. Let's do that A/B test. It's like it's using the product model to basically transform to the product model.
That's right.
Let's do some experimentation. Let's have an MVP test.
Yeah.
Let's pick a pilot team. Let's make sure that we have the right people in the roles. We're coaching them so that they know how to operate this way. And then compare the results of that pilot team against another team in the organization. And then make an assessment. Do we think that this is a model that we can replicate throughout the organization? And what would that path forward be? But just blindly going after the transformation, while I wish it were that easy, it's not a project. You need to really make sure that you invest in the leadership, you invest in coaching, you invest in the why, articulating that why, evangelizing that why, and then setting the organization up for success.
I like that. When a CEO will ask me all the time after I do a briefing about transforming to the product model, it's like, well, Christian, I don't know if this is going to work for us. I don't know if this is good for us. And I always say, I don't know either. Do a test. Do a test. And I tell them, like, look, there's some way in the back of your head where you're saying, every time we've done great work here, some of the principles you're saying resonate with me. We collaborate, there's clarity of context, We address our risk early. We know what the outcomes are. And I'm telling them, all I'm trying to say you're transforming to is you're making this something that you don't do sometimes in some places to something you do most of the time in most places. And I say, let's do a test. Let the teams help shape the change. Let's run a pilot. We're going to start small because if I say, let's get designers for every team in all circumstances, you're like, that is 50 designers, but can I get one designer and learn the impact of a designer in the company? You're like, it starts to become the realm of possibility. And we've got to create a feedback loop. We have to harvest our success to encourage other teams. We have to learn kind of your iterative aspect of it. You're allowing different cadences. You're breaking down barriers. More importantly, I always say you want to reduce the resistance to the change by addressing the fears. I think many people ignore that what's in it for me or the emotional side of change. And I see many things, particularly the example of moving to the product model. It's a threat to businesses, especially when some company says, we are sales-led. You've never had a salesperson complain about being sales-led. And then some group comes in and says, we want to become product-led. Just tell me what that salesperson is thinking. What does that mean? Are we all of a sudden saying, I don't have a seat at the table? I don't, and when you start to change the wording, and I think that's a practice of like trying to find how you take people on a journey to saying, we are moving from a relationship that is strictly subservient to one we are working together. I'm saying to you, like, I want to be closer to you so that you don't have to dump things on me. I'm saying to you, like, I want a deep understanding so that we can elevate our learning. Those kinds of things bring people on change than when you kind of just make a statement, we're moving product led. I'm like, what does that mean? Okay. This has really been insightful. And I love that, you've highlighted a couple of elements here. One of the ones I wanted to go back to, you kind of called out at the beginning, companies that have like a change management department. Companies recognize every time we've made a change, it's been disruptive. Things have gotten broken. People complain, the pitchforks out. We're going to have a change management department. Lea, you're coaching a change management department. All right. Like, talk to me. Like, give me the advice you give them. Like, what are you telling them? They have a charter, they have a mission. How do they support change in a company?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just to be very controversial, Christian, I probably would never coach a change management department. I'm sure there's a need for change management departments in some organizations. I think it's really making sure that the leaders in the organization understand what their responsibility is, and they also understand how to measure success. So another anti-pattern that I see in organizations is we measure success by the number of teams that have moved to the product model. That is not an indication of success, right? The indication of success should be the business results that those teams are able to achieve. Just checking the box in terms of the number of product managers we have, or in your example that you just gave, the number of designers that we've hired into the organization, that's not the indication of success. That's the activity that we do in order to achieve that success, but that's a very different metric to move on. So one of the things that I would do instead of coaching the change management organization is I'd work with the leaders, the product leaders, as well as the senior leaders of the organization, and define what success looks like. How are we going to quantify success? How do we know that we've succeeded in moving and operating this way? And is it having a benefit for your customers? And is it having a benefit for the business?
I love that a lot. And candidly, Lea, it's because outcomes or results are hard. I often talk to people, I'm like, it's easy to measure. We changed the number of titles. We had 12 training events. It's easy to measure the number of releases. Building stuff on its own is not hard. You can build a lot of crap. Building stuff on time these days is not hard too. You can take out a lot of scope. But changing getting results, making an impact. And I think it's very tempting. So we need to call out two aspects. I think one, change is hard, and the results from change, measuring and getting to the outcomes, is really, really hard. And I think leaders have to own that. Last question here. I'm an individual or an individual contributor in a company going through a change. Whether that's an acquisition, a new rollout, org structure change, title change, They are moving to the product model change. What is the best way to respond? What are some tips you give people in a company in how they respond to change and how they best contribute, support a change in the organization?
I mean, for an individual contributor, one of the things that I would focus on is, well, first and foremost, assume goodwill, right? I think that that's something that's important, right? The machine is not out to get you. Let's assume goodwill, that you're going to have a very productive part of the future. I think the other thing is I think every individual has an opportunity to be part of the problem or part of the solution. So, opting to be part of the solution and actively contribute to that, I think it creates a higher purpose for an individual that I would highly encourage them to consider versus fighting against the change. Because quite frankly, it's actually easier to be part of the solution than it is to fight against the change.
You're calling out some agency, and that's a whole topic because I don't know
Yeah.
if you've
Yeah.
even noticed. I've had situations where the finger pointing of the change goes all the way up. Like you're talking to a leadership team, but the board demanded it, or like it goes all the way up. My manager, the executive team, the board. It's easy to also indicate that it's happening to me than I am the one making it happen. I think we called out the first point, and it's a good place to reemphasize as we end, is people give what has been given to them in terms of context and why. If I don't know why it's happening, I'm going to say because my manager said so or because I said so. I don't have an explanation that is better than that. And so, one of the coaching aspects is, I want to make sure I can support this change well. Why do you think we're doing this? What is the motivation? Sometimes you need to ask those questions to probe. And if your leader is saying like, oh, I don't know, say, wouldn't it be great if we both understood it so that we can actually do a better job of supporting it? So there's some part in actually getting context or hunting for context that creates agency, like kind of gets you feel like an owner. I really love this episode. If I were to recap how well to change based on our conversation today, I like this idea of getting buy-in from the top, kind of understanding the why and the context. I think that's a great place to start. I like this idea of identifying and recruiting, let's call them change champions. I like this idea you talked about of change discovery. You're kind of discovering how to change and co-creating change. Like let the team or the people affected by the change pilot, give you feedback loop. In some ways, I do love the data storytelling aspect of good change. Someone is taking you on a journey. I want to make sure I emphasize the resistance to change, understanding that it affects the individual, not just the company, and I always tell people, people are the only people that can care about people. Companies are not, they cannot feel how you feel. So it's like the company is changing. You mean many people are going to be affected by something. And so we kind of anchored on how you reinforce and sustain change. I love that you talked about coaching, and we talked about training versus coaching, reinforcing the new behavior, replacing the behavior you don't want with a new one you want, and maybe celebrating those behaviors, those small wins, recognizing people. One last aspect that I think would be important is leaders have to model
They do.
change they want.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what's okay in a company unless they see a leader do it.
I totally agree. One point on that, Christian, just before we close, that I think is really important. One of the biggest catalysts that I've seen in organizations to help facilitate that change is leaders asking the right questions, creating this culture of curiosity and asking the right questions and making sure that the teams understand that the leaders are engaged in the decisions that are being made.
Please, as I emphasize to everybody I coach, they make leadership not just a very lonely sport to play, but one that loses all of its vulnerability because oftentimes leaders feel they cannot say things like, I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm not clear. And you go to big meetings with the town hall and a leader never asks a question because, if you ask a question to the CEO, you'd be like, don't you understand it? How can you be a leader and not know this answer? And so they kind of hide in this bubble of shame that almost reinforces this victim mentality. And I tell leaders two things: model for people. It's okay to say, I'm not sure. I don't understand. I need help. And go get that as much as you can in your one-on-ones. but you need to model out the fears and anxieties people may be feeling in the real world. Yeah, this has been always fun as usual. I hope people that are going through change, people that are in an environment of change, recognize that change is not an event, it's a journey. Kind of call that out in some ways. And, we want that teams can own it, can participate, and people feel empowered to participate in the changes they may be going through. Lea, such a pleasure to have you again. Want to learn more? Until next time, please check out svpg.com, sign up for our newsletter that Maddie Kagan puts out, join us for one of our workshops near you, and get access to all of the articles and content we put out. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Until next time, have a good day.
A quick disclaimer, while this podcast is named Product Therapy, it is not hosted by licensed therapists or mental health professionals, and it is in no way a substitute for professional mental health services. We recognize the importance of mental well-being and encourage anyone facing personal difficulties to seek support from qualified professionals. See www.findahelpline.com